So the question you brought up is kind of indicates or points to maybe an even more general cultural trend, that what's worthwhile and virtuous is difficult and unpleasant, and what actually makes us happy is usually immoral. And a lot of people will say that's, maybe Protestant or Calvinist, Christian influence, that suffering is really good, maybe Christian in general. I don't think Jesus ever taught anything like that, but I think it became a perspective. But I think you can see it in other cultures too, so I don't think it's limited to Christian influence. And it even goes so far as to cover subjects like food, like if it really tastes good, it's bad for you. And if it tastes like sawdust, it must be good for you, this kind of thing. But as your intuition is that this is very questionable, I think that's true, that it's a deep misunderstanding. And maybe one way to start looking at it and see what's going on is your use of the word fun. That if you're trying to help someone but it's fun, it's probably not really deep help. So fun.
I use the word fun in a loose way. Basically, not suffering.
Basically.
Not suffering. Not
suffering.
Not unpleasant. Not feeling unpleasant about
right. It. But you did pick that word, and there are many words for not suffering, and fun does indicate a kind of generally used in a kind of more superficial sense. Distracting, entertaining. We're not aware of suffering. Still might be going on, but we're ignoring it. People drink to have fun, and we also know people drink to ignore their problems. Usually fun is considered pretty superficial. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't have deep awareness of deeper states of joy. They associate positivity in their life with kind of light fun. If there's not light fun happening, it's depressing or anxiety or fear. But when we look more closely at what I'm terming light fun now, and these are just words and people use them all differently, so words might mean something else to someone else, but it's usually just a distraction and not deeply satisfying, not deeply joyful. Just a little numbing. So in that sense, if we're just being distracted, we probably aren't helping in such a deep way. Because our full body and mind, our full attention isn't in it. So that's where there might be some truth in that idea. But when our full attention is in what we're doing, meaning we're present and we're open, and we're feeling what we're feeling, and we're attentive and alive and vibrant, not seeking a way to be distracted, not seeking a way to impress, not seeking a particular temporary stimulation that might feel good and then pass, but really just fully aware and awake. There's a deeper joy that can arise, and this is also the state we're in when we're helping in the most profound way. So in the same way that I'd say that healthy food, when you're really attentive, is actually more delicious. Yeah. So junk food might be exciting and stimulating temporarily. There's a lot of fat and sugar mostly, right? Or salt, if that's your thing. Instant stimulators, instant things we have kind of addictions to. So it grabs your attention. And you're distracted from maybe our anxiety. That's why a lot of people, when they have a lot of anxiety, will start eating a lot of that food. They just desperately want to be pulled away by something dramatic, some dramatic sense stimulation, right? But when you're really attentive to it, it doesn't actually taste so good. You feel the stimulation, but it's kind of like a jolt, and then it passes, and the feelings are not so good in your body and in your mouth even. Whereas when you're really attentive with healthy food, you start noticing more and more of its beauty and how it feels in the body. So when we're addicted to instant stimulation, the more quiet, contemplative tastes don't seem satisfying because we're demanding this instant distraction. But when we get used to having that patience, we get a deeper satisfaction. So just like with food, that could be called the Sattvic attitude toward food. And just like with food, all of the things we do in our lives are like we go to party and we get drunk, and it takes superficially a little of our need to be distracted from our anxiety away, but the anxiety is still there happening. And when we give more attention to what's happening, we still see the anxiety trying to impress people. You see, it's not really a joyful state, getting drunk and partying so much. There might be parts of it that are truly joyful, so I'm making a generalization, but not that deep sense of belonging, that deep sense of aliveness that our heart really wants. So one way you can look at spiritual practice is we learn renunciation from the things we thought maybe initially were fun, distracting. Maybe we're asked, or there's examples of spiritual practitioners that gave up those things, and it seems stark and austere. But the point is to renounce the superficial distractions that aren't giving you real satisfaction, so you can start appreciating what gives you the deeper satisfaction, so you can have a deeper joy. So it's not about suffering for its own sake because it's somehow meritorious. It's about giving up a very superficial, fun distraction in order to start tasting what our heart really wants, a deeper belonging, a deeper contentment, a deeper connection, a deeper belonging. And we can't get that if we just keep being distracted, because we're not addressing the anxiety and releasing the anxiety. We're just trying to cover it over, and it's still operating. So you asked specifically about helping people. When we're helping because of a sense of obligation or an intellectual idea, this is the right thing to do, but it doesn't really resonate with our heart, then it tends to be not superficial and not feel so satisfying. We're more fulfilling an anxiety. We're trying to assuage one anxiety that I need to do this to be a good person. We're not really replacing it with who we are. Just following some idea, which in itself is another anxiety. So that might feel like suffering, but that's not actually such a good way to help. If we let go of our ideas of what's right or wrong, or what we should be doing, or who we think we should be, and just actually are who we are, and trust that. I mean, we are anyway, but let go of following pushes to do things, anxious pushes to do things from some ideology we have. And just return to presence, and just fully accept the moment, and how we are, and how we're feeling in the moment. And let our compassionate action arise naturally from there. And if we don't trust we're compassionate at heart, that's very hard to do. But with a little contemplation, if we think we need to push ourselves to follow an ideology in order to be compassionate, and if we don't do that, we'll just be selfish. But then we can ask ourselves, well, why do I have this idea that I should be compassionate in the first place? Why does that seem so right? I would argue because it's really there. But the way you're channeling it, the way you're following through with it, involves a lot of artificial ideology that has a lot of pressure in it and anxiety in it. And won't feel fully natural and won't feel fully alive and vibrant. And won't be that kind of heart-help connection that is the most harmonious. It feels the most harmonious. Unpremeditated usually helps. It's just spontaneous. It just comes out. And when that does, it feels beautiful. Because it's the world doing it. And you're more aware that it's the universe doing it. When you're following an ideology, it very much seems your own little thing, your own little thinking, your own little self. And the own little self can't really help somebody else. Because if it's your own little self and the other person is separate, the help is limited to that model of separateness. The other person's an object for you to help. But that's not the reality. Real help happens when the two belong, and the two become one. And that only happens when your own idea of how to help drops away. And your sense that I am helping this other person, I'm going to suffer for this other person to be happy. That doesn't really exist in reality. We think, I will take on suffering for this other person to be happy. But that just maintains that these two people are separate. And if you look more deeply, it's usually the person suffering it's just a misguided way to try to make themselves happy by thinking they're more virtuous by taking on suffering. But someone taking on suffering isn't going to help somebody else. It's going to increase suffering in the universe. It's going to encourage the other person to take on suffering. So that's why even with something as mundane as sharing something, if you really don't want to share it, I wouldn't share it. But you become aware, I'm just eating this myself and they don't have it. And when your awareness is strong enough, you want to share it, And you don't feel deprived of that piece of chocolate by sharing it. It can be mixed. You might have genuine desire to share and also residual desire to have that chocolate yourself. And then you just play with it and see how it feels. Usually after you've shared it and the other person's enjoying it, that releases and you enjoy it as well.
That's a really good analogy you brought up, because I was trying to think of analogies, and the one that you came up with is better than any that I could think of. So in this context, if I'm taking half a chocolate bar and I'm sharing the rest with one or two other people, and I'm enjoying it as well. But if there are more people and I share it with more of them, if I'm not suffering, that is, if I am not feeling that, oh, I wish I had more chocolate to enjoy, if I'm not feeling that feeling, that means I can do more to get there. I'm not doing my best to put it in.
I would say we have to be very careful about doing our best. We're always doing exactly what we have to be doing. We're always doing what the universe is doing. When we accept how we are as actually how we are, we're really opening the door to insight and awakening. So if we're constantly walking around with this ideal of how we should be, and it's in contrast with how we are, and we're trying to reach that how we should be, I mean, that's natural that we have that. That's how we've all grown up. But this practice is asking us to take the next step and graduate from that and give it up.
So conversely, taking this analogy further, isn't it an indication that if I'm suffering, suffering in quotes here, because not having chocolate is not really suffering, but
there's some anxiety there.
Yeah. And that is an indication that I'm still holding on to the desire for chocolate. I can let go of it. So isn't that,
you maybe you can't let go of it in that moment. That's what I'm saying, and that's okay. It's really okay. I do that sometimes. I have strong desire for the chocolate, and I think if I force myself to share it, I might know from past experience, I force myself to share it, and then I'm going to be happy. I'm going to let go of not having the chocolate. But sometimes I'll just be like, I'm not going to bring the chocolate bar up now. There's too many people. I really want this chocolate. I'm still attached to it. It's okay.
I mean, in the chocolate.
But you notice it.
Right.
And then there might be a little sense that I'm attached to this chocolate, and that's kind of a burden. And from some experience that when you're like, I like this chocolate, but it'll be really fun to give it to all these people instead, and then you give it to them and they're all enjoying it, and you feel happy, and you realize, I didn't need the chocolate. My happiness wasn't connected to the chocolate. Really, your happiness isn't connected to sharing it either. Your happiness is inherent. But sharing it helps you understand it wasn't dependent on the chocolate. But you don't have to share everything all the time. If you get too attached to an ideology, I should never enjoy the chocolate, you're falling to the other extreme. You're going to the side that's like suffering is inherently virtuous. Depriving myself is always a good. That's not true. It just depends on what's naturally happening if you're really awake and aware and present at the time. If you're really present at the time, it might be fun to share, but maybe not. Maybe you have an intuition the other person doesn't need chocolate. Neither of us need chocolate right now. I mean, who can say? There's no rule. That's the thing. The rules is what gives us anxiety. I'm not saying we should never use rules, both for ourselves and others. There's times managing gross level material things that we might need some rules to help us, depending on who we're dealing with, children or adults that are acting like children or whatever. But on a more subtle level, we should realize this is just memory baggage. This is just an idea of myself from the past that I'm maintaining, and it's blocking out the full vibrancy of the moment. That has no self and is not interested in memory and in upholding a certain ideal and in trying to be the most sharing person. that's another arrogance. Just like being the person who has accumulated the most chocolate, more than everyone else, and then you're a winner, like our president, maybe not much longer. He's an example of, like, that's how you become a winner, get the most chocolate. Someone else would be like, give the most chocolate away, that's how you're a winner. That's not really true either. It might be a little more subtle. You might understand that including other people, sharing, helps us to let go of this separate self idea, which is true. But if you make a self that you're proud of because you share more, you're still just arrogant. You're still just self-centered. Real non-self-centeredness doesn't know what to do. It's just alive. It's just happening. And when you're really alive, you feel the other person. If you feel like, wow, they're really hungry, you just want to give them food. Or they haven't had chocolate in a month, and I eat chocolate every day, and I have this chocolate, I just want to give it to them. It's just natural. But if you don't feel that naturally, you're like, I'm kind of attached to the chocolate. You just notice, I'm attached to the chocolate. And you kind of know that's not really the right thing to be attached to. But I'm gonna notice that and see how it bubbles up in my body mind in the next moment.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The other week we were talking about how there's no free will, and with this example, is it already like predetermined that what's going to happen with the chocolate bar? It's like we actually don't have a choice. Is that? I mean, would you go as far as to say that? And then it's almost like there's just a movie that's happening and there's actually no control. I mean, or is that already intellectualizing it so much that, I mean,
Well, it's inevitable.
not even really worth going down that.
Right. I mean, it seems to be worth it for some people if it leads to awakening, and other people don't need to go through it intellectually, so it depends on the person. But, that's a very challenging, natural, intellectual, philosophical question that comes up when we talk about presence practice. And I don't usually talk so much about the illusion of free will because, for one, it's very challenging to people and quite scary to people. But it's true that that's what you face when you're looking at presence practice. But you see that free will is an illusion because there's no person there to be choosing things. So in order to have free will, we have to have a chooser. And when we're really giving attention to the moment of being alive, there is no person that's a chooser. So when choices arrive, they arrive because they arrive. Because the universe has them arrive through your body-mind. So rather than say to people, there is no free will, and predetermined is a little different, so I'll say something about that in a second. But to tell people there's no free will sets up a defensiveness, because our egos, our sense of self is based on having free will and choice. That's its function. So it's kind of like, it's very challenging to people, and it'll set up a resistance. Whereas if you really just focus on presence and letting go, and presence and letting go and being alive, you will come to that realization yourself without needing the intellectual position necessarily. But predetermined usually makes people think that it's kind of written down somewhere. Like the future is somehow known by some being or something, and there's a plan or a map somewhere, but that's not true either. That's a made up idea, right? But that's in the consciousness of time, of thinking past and future. If there isn't free will, that's the only other option, that things are predetermined. But reality, when you let go of your ideas, doesn't have time. Time is an illusion. So it doesn't make sense to say predetermined. The future's not waiting to happen. There is no future. There is no past. There's only what's happening. Our brains, though, our thinking minds can't wrap intellectually around that. It's impossible to do. The way our minds function is through an imagined past and future. So it can be helpful sometimes to realize what happens has to happen that way, because that's true. But there's not you can't know what's going to happen. You can't access it somewhere,
Yeah, like that.
It's inherent in the present, but you can't access it.
What you just said, like if I have an argument with someone and afterwards I review that understanding, like that just had to happen, it's really helpful that I'm not this screw up or whatever.
Exactly, because shame and guilt can be let go of.
Yeah, it's just like that happened, it's not even like what can I learn from it, it's just kind of like that happened.
Judgment can be dropped. So that's why it's so important. So even closer to the present, it's not exactly the present, but even if you're judging this situation like I wish I was in a different place, or I should have been in a different place, or why didn't I go to this thing today instead of this place? Why didn't I go to the party instead of this sitting group? It couldn't have been any other way. And to realize that is a great relief. It's another way to drop the self, because the self is based on making decisions. And if you realize it's just happening, you realize you are part of the whole universe happening. But that doesn't mean we're not going to stop experiencing choice. We still experience choice. But when we understand it's not ultimately real, we have less attachment to it, and we don't suffer around it so much.
Okay, so when there is apparent conflict, it's happening. There doesn't have to be the weight of it.
Yeah, there's no judging about what's the right thing to do or wrong thing to do. It's just happening as it is. Also, you can realize the other person is actually the universe as well. So the whole sense of division is made up. One nice way to put in words the freedom, free will question is what Krishnamurti said when asked about free will. Is free will real? He says, well, of course not. It's a contradiction in terms. So there is freedom. But when there's will, that's not free. So your will is your conditioning. He spends a lot of his talks focusing on recognizing that we're conditioned. That we think we're these people making up we're these free people making up our own decisions, but actually it's just conditioning unfolding. When you see that, when you really see that and stop thinking you're in control and realize you're just this conditioning, then something changes. The conditioning manifests, controls you through the illusion of thinking that you're a separate self doing free will. So when you see that that's not true, the conditioning suddenly loses its energy. Does that make sense?
What's the definition of will?
It's your determination to control the future is one way to say it. You're going to make this thing happen. I'm going to make this thing happen. So that will is conditioned because of your genetics and your background and your history and all the things that have happened to you. You want to do this particular thing and not something else because of your conditioning. So that's not free. You're just manifesting your causes and conditions. Your karma is just another word for it. When you see that that's what's happening, you let go of thinking that you're this self-controlling thing. When you feel that, the conditioning suddenly loses its energy because it's conditioning you through the sense of I want this and I want that and I'm controlling this and I'm controlling that. When you no longer want to do that, that all drops away and there's just presence happening, and that's freedom. That's not controlled. The experience that happens was controlled by causes and conditions. But the experience itself doesn't have time anymore, and so it's not controlled. So you can only control things through time. Does that make sense? So this sounds so philosophical, and in words it is. You can say it is philosophical, but it's pointing at actual lived experience. So when you let go of the sense of control and will, and that there's a person that's going to determine the future, and you're just what's happening, then everything is completely free. There's no limitation. There's no comparison. There's no self and other. There's no past and future. And that's freedom. Because all those things are boundaries. All those things are limitations. So when your will drops away, then you're free. You can't have free will. That's like free being controlled. It doesn't make sense. That's just one way to look at it. There's so many ways that you can talk about it, and none of the ways are perfect. They're trying to indicate something that you can't intellectually grasp, but is our lived experience.
Shut off after 30 minutes, definitely.
Start again. This is the best part.
I think that's a little different than what I used to think. Like free will meaning like if I'm thinking my arm and I'm like, I want to raise the arm and the arm raises. That's a little different than like wanting things to go a certain way and then being frustrated if they don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be much
There's not suffering.
emotional baggage and suffering over raising your arm, yeah. But it's really true there too. The fact if you're raising your arm or lowering your arm is conditioned. You're not really free to do it. But when you see that, you're in freedom. The body-mind keeps working by conditioning, but you're free because you're not playing the game of trying to control things. Does that make sense?
Is there like a way to like kind of test that? Because I feel like I'm not. I mean, it's hard to grasp.
Well, you can't really grasp it, so it's just indications. You can see it, though. What were you going to say?
There is this published research where there's a psychological experiment where they run electrodes through different parts of the body, and they indicate the participants to do some activity, and based on the electrical activity they figured out that the awareness that you wanted to move the arm came after you actually gave the signal to move the arm. So the brain kind of pieces together these signals to make you believe that your intention was to do that, whereas it would have happened anyway, and then you are led to believe it's because of your choice.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. That doesn't make it true, because even if your will to do it came first, the reality of it would still be the same. The reality of the fact that it's conditioned would still be there. But that makes it more obvious, because it couldn't have been your will. In a very conventionally rationalistic sense, you can see that it couldn't have been your will in that case. But you understand how it's not necessary that that's the case for the spiritual understanding of it to be true. Because even if your will came first, the will is also conditioned. Even if your awareness of wanting to raise your arm came first, that's conditioned.
Because it's a movement through time, you mean?
Well, it needs time to be conditioned, but
I'm thinking of it like a heartbeat. Heartbeat happens, and I can always pretend that I'm causing it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's with heartbeat. It sounds ridiculous because it's well established that that's not a causal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But with hand or with any other motor activity, we can make the connection.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I was approaching it. It's kind of like heartbeat, in that it happens. For what reason? Who knows? But I can be convinced that I wanted it to happen, and so I made it happen.
Yes, you can be convinced. So that scientific information is helpful in seeing we have less control than we think. But what I'm saying is, even if that experiment didn't come out that way, and the awareness of wanting to move your arm came before the impulse to move the arm, it's still true that it's conditioned. Because the idea, I want to move my arm, is already conditioned. Yeah. It's not, it doesn't have to be that the physical happens before the awareness. The awareness also is conditioned. Yeah. Yeah. In other words, the body is more gross level than the mind, right? So we can say, we can see the body is not under our control. But the realization of not self is not just that the body is not under control. The mind is also not under control. So awareness is something, I'm now making a distinction. This is just how we're using words. But I'm making a distinction between awareness and the mind. Some people will use mind meaning awareness, so now I'm making a distinction. But the mind is its conditioned thinking and its habits, and I want this, and I think I'm like this, and I'm afraid of the dark, and whatever it is, is not the same as awareness. Awareness is aware of all that. And awareness is where freedom is. And awareness is not in time. But the thinking mind is in time. Past and future and the self and all those ideas. And the thinking mind is, I'm going to lift my arm. Usually you don't say this, it's more automatic, but I'm going to lift my arm and get that cookie and eat it, and that'll make me happy. But awareness doesn't have that agenda. Awareness is just aware of that. So the thinking mind is, later I'm going to get that cookie, and then it's going to be really good. So it's in time, and that's the self. The more it becomes abstract, the longer the time generally in the future that you're planning for, the more suffering. So, yeah, the less you get wrapped up in your planning and scheming and controlling, the less suffering. And ultimate no suffering is not having any time, not having any agenda, just presence happening. And we can experience all these levels. We experience complete presence out of time. All of us do sometimes. We might not register it or we might not understand it, but we all experience that. And some words for that is bliss and awakening and whatever. And then we all have complicated desires and long-term planning and, very obvious complexes about who we are and the conflicts we're having with other people, and that's, obviously suffering.
It's funny how, I think until now, the distinction between, an unwanted thought, oh, there's this person and saying this drama and that versus I want to lift my arm, I really had a big distinction, and there's really not a distinction. It's just, it's so subtle and it's so ingrained with the I want to move my arm and right. I can do that it's...
But it does have less suffering in it because there's less self-agenda in it. So it depends. I mean, there might be no self-agenda in it. If something's coming at you and you lift your arm to block, that's just automatic.
Right.
There's no suffering in that.
Right.
I would say, as far as I can see. If you're grabbing a cookie, there's a little suffering, right? But if you didn't plan it out and you just saw the cookie and no one else is around, it's not so much suffering, right? If someone else is there and you're getting it before them, there's more suffering because you're starting to think about them and me and who's ethical, right? So it
But
gets more and
what
more
I'm saying is,
complicated.
like the thought of like I'm controlling the thought of lifting my arm versus like I have no control over
Right.
this recursive thought that I just can't let go of.
Right.
It seemed different, but now I'm really clearly seeing
It's
that
all the
it's
same.
Exactly the same.
It's all just the universe happening.
Right.
When you understand no self, there's no distinction. It's always the universe happening. There's never a self there. But it's easier to see that with things that have less heavy self-idea in it. So it's easier to see it that, well, my arm just went up. I'm not in control, right? Whereas when you're in a fight with someone, it's harder to see, I'm not in control. I'm just saying these things. I'm just feeling these things because the universe is. You're really, you sink down into that contracted sense of self versus that other person's sense of self and being in conflict, right? So it's harder, but it's always equally true. It's harder to see the more we're buying into a story of the self, the more we're in time. And you can tell when you're more in time because you bring up, last week you did that, and 2 months ago you did that, and you've been doing that for a year, you know. And I've been suffering for 8 months, and now I've had it, you know. So the more you're in time, the more you're in your self story. The more you're in your self story, the harder it is to see that this is just the universe functioning. But as soon as you see that, you can see that as soon as you really see that, even in the midst of a fight with someone, you're free. Freedom opens. As soon as you see this is not me trying to control the situation and fighting against this other person, this is just how the universe manifests. All of a sudden, that all the weight is gone. There might still be energy in the body, you know, you might still be shaking with anger or something like that. But it's all just energy then. The other person is just also the universe just happening that way, and you're just the universe happening this way, and there's actually no problem, and nowhere to get, and nothing to accomplish, and nothing to fix. It's just how it is. And in that moment, there's freedom, and in that moment, there's relief. And in that moment, you're not thinking about how long is this moment going to last? Will the stuff come back? Yeah, it'll probably come back, but that's irrelevant to the moment of awakening. Does that make sense? The self-story that's built on accomplishment and controlling and achievement and living up to standards, that whole self-story really doesn't like this teaching or this perspective. There's so much resistance to it. So it's good to notice that. But the heart really loves this perspective, really loves it. It's just resting. Just seeing that sunset. It's just feeling the sun on your skin. Or the cold, you know. If you're not thinking about, oh, I don't like to be cold and I want to get in. It's just seeing that bird suddenly in the corner of your eye fly up. Nothing's the problem. Nothing needs to be accomplished. That is who you are. That bird. That wind. Right now, I'm pretty chilly, so I'm feeling shivering through my body, but that's just who I am. There's no problem with it. I can just feel it. And those glowing leaves is also what I am, what you are. So to that part of ourselves that think we have to control ourselves or we're bad people, it doesn't like this perspective at all. It's just like, that's just indulgence to be really bad. But it's not. Really bad comes from trying to be something. That's where all the bad behavior comes from. Often being a selfish person, but sometimes trying to be the best person also creates a lot of damage. But realizing you're this moment completely is freedom, is peace. And it's not contained by you, so it's shared with everyone. There's no sense of you. I have this peace. That's why you can't say, I'm enlightened, I'm awakened. I'm enlightened and you're deluded. If you have that mind, that's delusion. So it's a lie. That's why this is a famous phrase of the Buddha on awakening. I and all beings together attain the Buddha way. I mean, it's a silly, archaic language, and we can pick that apart, but that's the point. All beings together attain the way only. Of course, you don't attain the way, but the veil is lifted and you see there is only all beings. You didn't lift the veil. It's just what happened. It's such a radical perspective to move from the self that's trying to get satisfied to realizing satisfaction is when there isn't a self. It's very, very different. It's 100% different. You can help the self get less heavy, though. You can help the self. You can do things from a self-mind through time, still with the idea of accomplishment, that actually makes the self lighter. So then it can be given up. I mean, not so then it can be given up, but it seems to happen that way, that then it's given up. Through time, it seems that way. So if this kind of radical non-dualists that say there's no reason to do any practice. And ultimately that's true, and there's no person to do any practice. But as long as you are feeling the self, and the self is going to do something according to its desire and demand and control, it can do this practice of sitting and letting go. And the impetus to do that is coming from an intuition that the self is its own problem. There's an intuition that even while you're still holding on to the self, there's also the understanding that that's illusory. And so that's why something leads us to do this practice where we just stop doing. But when you're in stop doing, there's no more practice of stop doing. Does that make sense? Is this getting too abstract? When you're thinking of the practice of stop doing, it's still a little artificial. It's still doing something, right? That's okay. But we should notice that I'm still doing something. And then we refine it, and we stop doing that until we really stop. You can watch this in just one period of meditation. You can watch your mind try to let go and try to stop. And every time it does that, it's not stopping. Until you realize, I can't try to not stop. And then you kind of get to this place like, I don't know what to do. That give up is where freedom comes. Oh, it's already here. It's already done. Another word people use is there's no doer. It's just what's happening. Doing is happening, but there's no doer behind it. That's the illusion we have. It's a person back behind the eyes, right? Controlling the levers. Does that seem clear? Is there any questions, objections? Any other things to bring up?
So, just small doubt is going back to the chocolate analogy.
I like chocolate analogies because I like chocolate.
The reason we we can see it as not suffering. Suffering is too strong a word, but
Discontent?
letting. So no, we had earlier discussed letting go of the desire for chocolate.
Mhm.
And you pointed out that is an agenda. That would be an
Mhm.
agenda,
Mhm.
and so I was thinking that it might be a practice for letting go of the idea of self ultimately. So I agree that there is an agenda, but isn't that the same as the agenda of any other spiritual practice?
Yes. So all agendas are delusion and have suffering in them. But there's different degrees. And, we'll be drawn to what we're drawn to.
No,
I've learned from not wanting to share something and pushing myself to share it. And I've also learned from not wanting to share something and not sharing it. And I've learned from when I just genuinely want to share and there's no resistance. I've learned from it all. You just watch it all. The point is to relax our beliefs. So we're drawn to something that seems wholesome and we're drawn to it and we feel at ease. Do it. But when we have some ideology, we think something's right and it's usually creating anxiety and conflict. Just realize it's not right. It's never right. Any ideology is always a delusion. Let go and just be in presence and see what happens. See the thoughts that you're thinking, feel the feelings you're feeling, don't judge them. If you judge them, notice you're judging them, see how that feels, There's nothing else we can do. But the more easily we can let go of any belief that comes up, the more we'll be free. And I would say the more we'll be truly loving as well, but that you have to discover. I don't want to put that out as an ideology. But I think it's pretty intuitive that when you feel free, you're going to be loving. When you feel constrained and caught and imprisoned, you're not going to be loving. You're going to be fearful and more antagonistic. In a sense, the refining of our spiritual practice is noticing more and more the subtle ideologies that we start to cling to and just releasing them. So generally, it's first that people see, I'm selfish, I need to share more, and they share more. And that's a good step at that stage. At another stage, you might be like, I'm pushing myself to share too much, and this is also artificial, Until you have no idea of sharing or not sharing, you're just who you actually are, with no agenda and belief that's creating conflict. But that includes not being some spiritual policeman that's watching to see if you have any agenda in conflict and saying, you're bad, you have an agenda. Yeah, agendas come up. It's just how easily they come up and are let go of. It determines how much you suffer. So conditioning keeps functioning. But if you don't believe it, you're free of it. You see that awareness itself is not conditioned. And that's who you are. Your awareness itself. The conditioning is just the display. It's just what's coming through.